Appearance on Dion's Daily Dose does not imply endorsement from or by any candidate or guest. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed by Dion Bergeron or Dion's Daily Dose are his own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of any guest. Material and information presented is for general information purposes only. The Dion's Daily Dose name in all forms and abbreviations are the property of its owners, and its use does not imply endorsement of or opposition to any specific organization, product, or service. If you'd like to support the show, please visit our Patreon at patreon.com/Dion's Daily Dose.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Dion's Daily Dose Presents Face to Face with Dion and Sean. I'm Dion.
And I'm Sean.
Welcome. So today we are doing a follow-up on a story that we did earlier about basically eugenics in the 21st century and the way that trying to think of the word for it, but essentially created human beings, genetically modified human beings from birth is happening across the world, predominantly in China and a few other areas. Israel pioneered some of the technology. China pioneered some of the technology.
And now we're seeing the beginning. Today we're going to cover basically the beginning of the eugenics movement back in like 1907.
Yeah.
And this was the ugly part of the eugenics that I was trying to talk about. And then I couldn't get it out. But yes, so this is the eugenics in Indiana.
Right. And here in Indiana, we actually have an interesting history with eugenics. Now, I'm going to say Sean has seen the video.
I have.
And has been kind enough to give us timestamps for it. So we're going to use those timestamps in order to get you the maximum amount of information with the least amount of watching. Pretty much, right? So what we're talking about right now, what's the name of this video? Do you know?
This is from C-SPAN.
Okay.
And it's the Indiana Historical Society came and had a meeting. I believe it was the Indiana Historic.
Okay. So yeah, this is from November 22nd of 2022, and it's entitled Eugenics and the Law, and it's on C-SPAN, and it's Nicole Martinez Legrand, I'm not sure.
And we have no rights to this. We're just using it for fair use.
Right, fair use. And we're going to talk about like what's in this, and there's some interesting, some really interesting things that happen that they talk about. At least Sean has assured me. So I'm just kidding. All right, here we go.
Before we kick off into some questions and discussion, let's talk about a little bit about the history of eugenics. In 1883, Sir Francis Galton, a 19th century English social scientist, statistician, and psychologist, coined the term eugenics from the Greek word eugenes, meaning well-born. The practice of eugenics aims to improve the genetic quality of human population through selective breeding, encouraging reproduction for the strongest humans while discouraging reproduction for the weakest humans. In the late 19th century and early 20th century United States, eugenics programs received widespread public support. And they took two approaches, positive and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics encourage healthy people to perceive to have above average intelligence to reproduce. Negative eugenics, the predominant form in the United States, discourage reproduction and advocate for sterilization of those who have been perceived to have undesirable traits. Eugenics programs were supported by legislation, court rulings, and powerful promoters. An early advocate of eugenics was Harry H. Laughlin, director of the Eugenics Records Office at Cold Spring Harbor, New York, supported by compulsory state sterilization laws, and significantly shaped negative eugenics legislation policy in the United States.
I'm going to pause it here. We've got like another 3 minutes of this, but I wanted to stop real quick because what I find interesting that I'm not sure if you picked up on it, but in her speech, she said at the time, all these laws were looked very favorably upon. The population, even, we're not talking just lawmakers but in general, the population of the United States, specifically Indiana, was very much in favor of this kind of a thing, which is a little weird, right? Because we talk now about how eugenics bad, But what I think is necessary to call attention to is there are different kinds of eugenics that she was just talking about. One is the sterilization of undesirables, which Margaret Sanger, the whole Planned Parenthood movement, the not just sterilization, but removal of the undesirables via abortion or whatever. And then there's the improvement or planned breeding aspect of eugenics, which is really what we're talking about today, that we talked about in the other episode, which genetic design, that's what I was trying to think of. Designer human beings. Basically, you go in with CRISPR, you edit the DNA, and poof, your baby has, blonde hair, blue eyes, and is awesome. So, but that's the kind of selective breeding that they were talking about then, but obviously they didn't have the technology to do that at the time. So, and we're not really going to get too much into the nuance of, is this good? Is this bad? Because I think that's a personal determination, really. Society as a whole has a hard time building a consensus on what is good, what is bad. I think, especially once you get into the deeper technological advances and stuff like this, using CRISPR, right? In general, society, especially here in the United States, with the foundation of our Christian values, we've determined that hurting other people's bad, murder is bad, these things are bad, right? But then when you get into stuff like CRISPR, gene editing, it gets much more hazy.
A lot of gray.
There's a whole lot of gray.
There's not black and white.
Right. But back to the video.
Margaret Sanger, a strong advocate for women's reproductive rights, who also supported the eugenics movement, known as the founder of the Birth Control League. Sanger specifically supported sterilization of those who were considered mentally unfit.
Now, I would pause it there for a moment because, again, when you have people who are making the determination, what is mentally unfit? What is physically unfit? These are terms that don't necessarily have hard and fast definitions. They're it's like hate speech, right? Hate speech is whatever you want it to be. That's why it's so dangerous to allow anyone, progressives, conservatives, whomever, to police speech. Because what happens if a word that you use every day is suddenly wrong thing, right? Is suddenly added to the list of hate speech. Now you're in a lot of trouble. Back to the video.
Lastly, during the 1920s and the 1930s, the American Eugenics Society was founded. In addition to many local societies and groups across the country, members competed in fitter family and better baby competitions at fairs and exhibitions.
That's interesting,
isn't it?
Yeah, that is very interesting. So, a Better Eugenics Society was the name of it.
Yep.
Interesting.
Including the Division of Infant and Child Hygiene, directly immensely popular Better Babies contest at the Indiana State Fair from 1920 to 1932. And the list kind of goes on.
I'm going to stop there just for a moment because think of those dates, right? From 1920 to 1932. Now, I'm trying really hard not to be a so-called, Germany from the 40s apologist, right? Because that's not my goal. But given what she just said, remember, from the 1920s all the way up into the mid-1930s, we know what was happening in Germany, right?
Yep.
So the population of the United States had an overall positive view of eugenics. Follow that thought train just for a moment, right? So if we as a country, and we're generally, especially at that time, we were generally considered to be the most moral country around at that time, right? It's arguable these days, but going into the beginning or the prelude to World War II, the United States, whether right or wrong, was generally looked to as a very moral country. And if our population, who was, by the way, wholeheartedly against joining the World War happening in just a few years, if we had an extremely positive view of eugenics, it stands to reason that other countries would also have a generally positive view of such a thing.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
So it's easy now to look back and go, well, that was horrible and this was evil and this, they did this and they did that and they were all bad people. Maybe. But at the same time, I think it's important. A lot of context is lost when we don't understand or we don't study the history of certain things, right? For example, and I'm just going to throw this in, the Second Amendment. It's easy nowadays for these politicians to pick apart all the little words in the Second Amendment. But if you actually read the Federalist Papers and you read what the founders intended when they wrote the Bill of Rights, specifically the Second Amendment, their intentions are quite clear in those documents. And the intentions were that the American citizens, regular everyday people, should have at least as good of defense mechanism as the so-called armed forces, the standing armies, right? If not better. Now, if you look at the historical context there, you see, okay, this, right? But you get these politicians like, what's his name? I think it was Nadler, who left out parts of the actual Second Amendment when he was quoting it. And Massey called him to task on that. Did you see that?
I did.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was Nadler.
Yeah, I think it was Ralph Nadler who did that. Anyway, back to this.
And I want to thank you all for sitting through all of that. And let's get to the heart of this discussion. We know that Indiana was the first state in the entire union to pass the first eugenics sterilization law in the United States.
Let that sink in for just a moment.
Our home state.
Our home state is the state, Indiana is generally considered to be a pretty conservative or a pretty free state. We were the first in the nation to pass a sterilization law.
Back then, we weren't really a Republican state.
Yeah.
We were more of a what we call a purple state.
Yeah, that's a good. Yeah, that's a good qualifier because yes, at the time it was much more purpley.
Would anybody like to take up a little bit of the history of that, and what did that mean at the time?
Sure. So, eugenics thinking was.
Okay, so this is Jill Weiss Simmons, Simins, Indiana Historical Bureau. She's a staff historian.
Growing in many parts of the country at the turn of the 20th century. And bills had been introduced in other states, but didn't become law. So in 1907, Indiana had a unique combination of multiple factors that I think probably Sarah will weigh in on this too, that allowed the state to be at the forefront of eugenics legislation. And I think one of these main factors was that the same leaders that were having successes in Indiana's public health policy were also at the forefront of the eugenics movement. So we have people like the Indiana State Board of Health Secretary, John Hurdy. He had led successful campaigns against tuberculosis, and he advocated for public sanitation. And he believed that marriage bans and sterilization would help to make a stronger human race. This is not able to be separated from ideas about white supremacy that we'll circle back to. We had other leaders.
You know what? And it's really easy to roll your eyes at that and go, yeah, of course, everything's about white supremacy these days, right? But to be fair, Margaret Sanger was a white supremacist.
True.
Period. Like, You can
That's a
argue
fair
all you
point.
want, but she was, because she advocated for the extermination of what she considered to be lesser races.
True.
So the hero, just so everyone's on the same page, the hero of the left, Margaret Sanger, was in fact a white supremacist.
But we hear that so often.
We do, and nowadays we've become so tired of it. So just oversaturated. Move the frick on.
And we're a different society, in my opinion, than we were back then.
Absolutely, and that's just the way that it goes. We're very much a different society now than we were in even the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s.
We've come a long way.
We have come a long way in some areas. In some areas, I think we've had some backsliding going on. But it's a fair point that many of the eugenics ideas were rooted in a degree of supremacy of one sort or another, whether it is racial supremacy, whether it is, I guess. I don't know. I'll be honest, man. I don't know all the in words, right? But ableist or whatever, where you're against the handicap. I don't know all the nouveau, PC terms. What I do know is when you're talking about exterminating someone because they, for example, have Down syndrome, I have an issue with that.
I do too.
I have a problem with that.
That's wrong.
Yeah. But at the same time, as a parent, if you were given the opportunity, let's say money wasn't the issue, right? And you were about to, let's say your wife or you're a woman, you're pregnant, you go to the doctor and the doctor tells you, look, there's a very high chance that this baby is going to be born with insert genetic condition here, right? But all we need to do is a little bit of fiddle with this CRISPR thing, and we can get rid of that. Your baby will be born without said genetic defect or condition. Like, what would you do?
That'd be a hard call.
It would be, yeah, absolutely. It would be a hard call. That's why I try not to judge people based on the decisions that they make as a parent, because I don't know what I would do. I can say all day long, no, this is wrong and that's wrong. I wouldn't do this and I wouldn't do that, until you're in that situation. And then all of a sudden, all of your bravado and all of your, big bluffs and all that stuff just goes out the window, and you're thinking about, what do I do for my child? So, yeah.
This is like Oscar McCulloch, whose interest in eugenics came from his lifelong work with the poor, but he saw this as a losing battle. And so he became a eugenics proponent, and he was preaching this in his ministry. There's a long list of other people. We also had Dr. Harry Sharp, who had been conducting vasectomies at the Indiana Reformatory in Jeffersonville.
Okay.
All right.
So they were actively sterilizing people.
Yeah.
Performing vasectomies. And interestingly enough, as you heard, one of the biggest proponents of eugenics at the time became so because of his work with the poor.
Yeah.
And really put two and two together. Like, this guy's like, you know what? Helping them is a lot of trouble. What if we just sterilize them?
And the Great Depression was going on too in 1929.
That's a good point. Yeah, a lot of people, you got to connect the dates, right? The Great Depression was in full swing, and you're seeing these masses of people that don't have enough to eat, maybe don't have clothes to wear, and your solution, instead of increasing the things that they get, is, it'd be easier just to sterilize. Like, yikes.
Yeah.
Yikes. So our next, that was, just so you know, the timestamp on that, if you want to go back and watch, 7 minutes, 47 seconds to 12 minutes, 19 seconds. Our next one is 15:55 to 24:15. So let's see here. And again, we have on screen Nicole Martinez Legrand. She is Indiana Historical Society Multicultural Collections Curator.
Important for us to understand the intentions behind the movement so that we can better discuss 19th and 20th century ideas within the lens of our 21st century scientific medical knowledge and vocabulary. Weighing these, how can we better understand how these leaders were approaching this to benefit society? Do we think this is driven more biology or by economic concerns? And I would like to open the floor to everybody from our guests from Pennsylvania as well to chime in on this.
I think it's definitely both.
Okay, so now speaking, we have Sarah Halter, Indiana Medical History Museum. She is the executive director, or was at the time. I don't know what their structure
Yeah, I
is
don't
now.
Go ahead.
Yeah, it seems like it certainly would.
Okay, so she spoke long enough to get on screen and tell someone else to go. So this is Dr. James Peightel. It's Peighttel. And it just says psychiatrist. So I don't know what his connection is. He's probably just one of those people that they call in to weigh in on stuff. I'm not sure if he's connected with the Historical Society.
Don't know either.
Yeah. Anyway, let's hear what he has to say.
Would have been both, I think, the certain lay understanding of some, biological principles or scientific principles like from the origin of species, just basic ideas of natural selection and genetics, as well as the Mendelian genetics, sort of laid out an optimistic view that, we really could, in a more simplistic way, improve our gene pool, if you will.
Yeah, I think that.
And this is Jill Weiss Simmons again.
They couldn't separate their ideas about social worth and fitness from economic concerns at the time. They were applying those Darwinian ideas that you just mentioned about survival of the fitness to people with
survival of the fitness. Sorry. I know what she meant. I'm not going to poke fun at everything. I just thought that was amusing. Sorry.
Without considering social factors like economic downturns or the loss of a job or getting in an accident that makes it so you can't work, and that those factors can lead to poverty, crime, and illness. And kind of at the same time, this shifted the response to poverty and crime from the traditional church-led charity to state-led solutions like sterilization. So with eugenics leaders painting those they deemed as unfit as a drain on society, then sterilization was considered more progressive, more efficient, and more economically sound than charity or care in a school institution or poor farm.
Okay. I mean, again, we're talking about 100 years ago almost.
Yeah.
It's 2024 now, so we're talking 1924. That's 100 years ago. They're going to have different ideas. That's just how it is. And that's why it's so important to understand the context of history and how things were at the time. Like you said, the Great Depression was in full swing.
Yep. In 1929.
So
95 years ago.
95 years ago, the Great Depression was in full swing, and you have these people trying to figure out, what do we do? We have people starving to death in the streets. What do we do?
Yeah, there was this shift kind of in thinking.
Okay, this is Sarah Halter again.
Thinking about charity and government services, where people were starting to see insanity, mental deficiency, criminality as things that were inherited traits that a person couldn't help. So it was kind of hopeless to just keep pouring money into care for these people too. So it was.
And I want to stop there for just a moment, because that actually is a really good point that a lot of people, again, historical context is really important. At the time, there was very little understanding of mental illness in general. Schizophrenia, all of these things at the time were considered, like, we were barely out of considering it demonic possession. Not too many years ago, the church would have, in Matter of fact, not all that long ago, they were burning people at the stake.
True.
So, just historical context is important.
They were seen as these services, charitable organizations, were not only helping these people to survive, but they were actually thriving, and it was believed they were reproducing at alarming rates. And so there was a lot of victim blaming and fear mongering, but there was this idea that these services and charities were really just keeping these people going unnaturally, that these were people who in nature, social Darwinism, natural selection, survival of the fittest, those kinds of things would ensure that these lines died out, but we were keeping them going unnaturally.
And that is an interesting thought train, right? If you follow that. Because again, historical context, but the thought of survival of the fittest, your population that they're discussing in the wild, without society helping them, these populations would die out normally. So on the one hand, you can go, well, we should judge society by how they take care of the least fortunate, right? And there's another school of thought, much like the Spartans from Greece, right? That as long as we only keep the best, we're going to be the best. Which one is right? It's not up to me to tell you which one is right. You got to decide that for yourself. But it is an interesting thought experiment. And it is something that I think a lot of people are scared to actually talk about these days.
Yeah. And it was a drain on the economy. They used a lot of language describing people as useless
eaters,
costing taxpayers money, as dangerous, not only for society, but even for our personal safety. And so there was a lot of language being thrown around that kind of demonized people for their circumstances, and those kinds of ideas really stuck with people. And so it kind of helped to get some of that through.
And for those maybe who aren't paying attention, useless eaters is a term that's still thrown around by the elites, the ones who have more money than sense, the ones who, as a matter of fact, there's another program that I'm probably going to try to get to very soon, where it's that whole, I forgot the name of it, but basically the block movement where they ignore celebrities.
Yeah.
And these are people who genuinely believe you are not worth saving. That the useless eaters or the dregs of the poor, they still think of you that way. Don't get yourself twisted in thinking that this is everything in this video die out. Oh no, it's still there.
Okay, and so I feel like we're kind of scratching at the surface of
Okay, so this is Nicole Martinez-Legrand again.
this. And so, what ideological framework enabled Hoosier eugenicists to link the cultivation of better babies to the sterilization of defectives?
And that's I would say that's the heart of the matter right there, and that's the heart of the question. What policies were happening to where eugenics could, the proponents of eugenics could say, yeah, not only do we want positive traits bred into, right, but we want to breed out the negative traits. Well, the way you do that is by sterilizing those who have the negative traits you don't want. That's kind of the basis of eugenics to a degree.
So who were, we named some people, we named some Darwinian thought. Who were, what were some of the organizations, or just general organizations, or just basic ideological framework?
Right.
Well, the Better Babies movement is kind of the flip side of the coin for sterilization.
This is Jill Weiss Simmons again.
Way, instead of focusing on restricting the procreation of the undesirable, this was more about encouraging the fit to reproduce and help children thrive.
Okay, on screen it says Better Baby Contest, Indiana State Fair, August 31st to September 7th. Let's see here. And it's a photo, the left photo, John C. Allen. Johann Harris registering for the Better Baby Contest photograph, 1930. Indiana State Fairgrounds and Event Center collection, Indiana Archives and Records Administration, access to Indiana memory. The center, the poster for the Better Baby Contest. And then on the right, John C. Allen, Phyllis Marion Greer being weighed as part of the Better Babies Contest. Photograph, 1930.
The Better Babies Contest, they were organized by the State Board of Health and held at the Indiana State Fair. And at these events, workers distributed scientific literature on childhood diseases and better hygiene. There was a lot of educational component that went with this.
And that I'm all in favor of. By all means, educate, right? Education is critical. And I'm not talking about, the BS education. I mean, real, actual education is a critical foundation of any next level society.
Scholars have actually linked some of their efforts to the lowering of infant mortality rates in the years that this was going on. But we have to remember that it was only the Hoosiers that already had the time and resources to travel to the state fair that had the model white healthy babies that were receiving this information. So the contest both further entrench ideas about white supremacy, since the winning babies were always white babies, usually of middle or upper class families, but it also widens the educational gap on childcare.
Also true.
Those some really excellent points. And that was primarily during the 20s and 30s. But jumping back earlier to 1905, Indiana was tied to being home to one of the first restrictive marriage laws in the country.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Does she go further into detail on this?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Again, in 1905, passing or prohibiting mentally deficient persons with transmissible disease and habitual drunkards from marriage unions. And so this is kind of...
Okay, so if you have a disease that can be communicated,
Communicable.
Yeah, if you have a communicable disease or, like they said, perpetual drunkard, you were prohibited from getting married. So I guess to try to minimize the procreation.
Start where we see in the legislative forefront. Can we talk more about that? Sarah?
Well, I mean, it all goes back to the idea of preventing people who shouldn't be, or who are thought to not be fit to contribute to the gene pool from reproducing. But I think it was pretty obvious to most people that doesn't really prevent people from having kids, being married. But the isolation and segregation was the other side of that too. So there were restrictions on who could marry, but there were also a lot of people who ended up not just in mental hospitals, but in institutions for the feeble-minded and other kinds of institutions like that, who were segregated from the rest of society and they were isolated. And the idea was that if they were kept there, not only out of sight and out of mind of the public, but out of society, that they would be prevented from reproducing. And you see the 1907 law comes right after that too, where we should just start sterilizing.
Mm-hmm. So again, that thread of a legal framework.
Okay, so basically, it was a different time, like a very different time. And in 1905, the idea was we have to get some of this under control. You know, we have to, and it's natural for a society to look at how do we make our society better? How do we, produce better babies? Look at it now, right? The whole great replacement theory and all the stuff that, Tucker Carlson talks about and stuff like that. I'm not saying it's positive, negative, right, wrong. What I am saying is it's natural for us as a society to look at these factors, to look at things like this and go, is this the positive trajectory that we want for our society? And at the time, eugenics was the thought process. How can we make our society better? So the next clip is from 3106 to 4050. This guy's face trips me out. This Dr. James Freitel. Again, he's a psychiatrist. I don't know what it is about his particular appearance. I haven't seen any other pictures of him. I don't know who he is, but just this particular screenshot, he looks like a deer in the headlights. Anyway,
where Germany took it in the Nazi era.
Yeah. That idea kind of failed, though, really, because the immoral treatment was something that came out of some Quaker reform efforts, and it was really originally an attempt to keep doctors out of what we now call psychiatry. And they were doing more damage than they were doing good, and so.
And I would argue, as a completely uninformed opinion, I don't know that it's changed that much. Psychiatrists do an insane amount of damage to people.
They can, yeah.
I have friends who, I'm going to say this, especially in the 80s, the late 80s, early 90s, there was this huge push by doctors to medicate the hell out of people. That was their answer for everything. You go to a psychiatrist, there was a particular psychiatrist here in Michigan City area, Dr. Agarwal, right? Short little Indian lady. And she would spend 2 minutes with a patient and then write them prescriptions for a bunch of different mind-altering drugs. I would argue that psychiatrists continue to do damage. Anyway.
They can also help.
Let me be clear. I don't want to just bash psychiatrists, because there are those that I have found that are really good at what they do, and medication is kind of their last resort, right? Those are the ones that I would encourage people. If in your first visit the doctor wants to drug you up, I think you should question whether or not you should continue seeing this. I'm not a doctor. By all means, consult your physician or your psychiatrist or whatever. Not giving, medical advice, but I am saying do your research on everyone before you turn your health care over to them. I think that's a good summary right there.
Quakers started opening these institutions where people were going to be cared for humanely. They were going to be given lots of fresh air and sunshine and beautiful surroundings, and
it may have been designed that way, but these mental institutions that they opened, they were horrific places. Absolute, like, human rights violation type of places. So that's kind of what they turned into. And then they closed them all, and then they, that's why so many of the mentally ill are now in prison versus these hospitals, and prisons aren't built to deal with them, and that's a whole other show.
And they did have success. There's evidence that a lot of people improved because of that. But then when states and governments start opening these mental hospitals, and the doctors get involved again with good intention and high hopes and all of that, but we were limited in terms of our understanding of these diseases. We didn't have an effective arsenal of therapies. There were all kinds of problems related to money that very quickly overwhelmed hospitals. There was mismanagement of funds, misappropriation of funds, political cronyism, nepotism. All these things caused all these huge problems in these hospitals. So by the mid to late 19th century, you see these hospitals filling up with patients who aren't being adequately cared for, and they're in facilities that are falling apart because they weren't well made in the first place. They're not well staffed. The staff aren't well trained. They're not well paid. They're not equipped emotionally to deal with all of this.
And I would argue that that's the situation we're looking at today with a lot of these nursing homes.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah, the staff is poorly paid there. And you guys have seen the videos of the various, and again, the majority, just like police officers, correctional officers, stuff like that, the majority never make the paper because they're doing their job and they're doing what they're supposed to. But the 1% screw it up. You've seen the pictures of these caregivers that, slapping old people and, stuff like that. That's what it's a holdover from that type of thinking. And especially like some of these nursing homes make ridiculous amounts of money. They could absolutely afford to pay their people more. No doubt about it.
And the Biden administration is cracking down on nursing homes, which is probably another story for another show. But
yeah, they should. They should. I will say this. I was actually extremely disappointed in the way that COVID was handled in a lot of states, Indiana as well. And the whole locking down the facility and not letting the elderly, visit with their families. Yep. And there are people who didn't get to see their loved ones at the end. We can pick that apart all day long. Hindsight is always 20/20. But even at the time, I'm like, nah, this is not going to end well. So,
and then they put patients that had COVID mixed with patients that didn't have it.
Right.
In New York.
Like intentionally, there's no way that was accidental, dude. Like, no way.
And so you see outcomes, right? And so that kind of contributed too to the sense that mental diseases were not as curable as we thought, because look at all these hospitals that are filling up with patients and they're not going home because they're not getting better. And so you start seeing, and this kind of is tied to that shift in ideas about charity that I mentioned.
You know what? I think this is a good spot to interject this. What I found recently, there was kind of a revelation, right, that came to me. She mentioned charity. I think this is a good time to throw this in. Do you notice that the nature of charity has kind of changed over the years, right? When we were, at least when I was young, churches in general handled the vast majority of kind of helping their communities, right? Feeding the homeless, toy drives, all this stuff in general was handled by little local churches. With the shift, it's now more of these liberal run organizations that are doing this kind of stuff. Less so the deep conservatives. And I'm not talking about these mega churches. I'm talking about your real local church. They used to have like all these food pantries and food drives and handing out toys for the kids. Now you got places like the Salvation Army. That's really about it.
There is still churches that do it.
Sure, absolutely.
There's one in Couts that still does it today.
Yeah, they exist. Don't get me wrong, they exist.
But you're just saying it's not as much as it used to be.
It's not nearly as widespread as it used to be. Like, you used to be able to count on your local church, especially if you were a member. If you attended every once in a while even, and you ran across hard times, it was the church's job to help you. That's why you were not the only reason, but one of the reasons why you were a member is the family atmosphere and help each other. But now we've gotten to where it's a very disconnected, just let the government handle it. Just let the government handle it. And unfortunately, in many cases, our government is led by bureaucrats. And efficiency is not exactly the number one goal of these bureaucrats.
And the nice thing about churches was that they knew what your situation was too.
Right. They knew about you. They knew who you were. They knew, you had 4 kids or 1 kid or whatever. And they knew, you were involved with them. So they knew.
With the government, you're just a number. So yeah,
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that's worth a deep dive at some point. But back to the video.
You see kind of a decrease in state funding for these facilities at the same time, and that's when they really need it the most. And so there were, of course, there's a difference between traumatic injuries and things like congenital defects and disorders that were thought to be hereditary. But yeah, it's really interesting how quickly that sort of went down the toilet.
Yeah, and here in Philadelphia, also with the Quakers, but regarding people who were incarcerated, there's still the Eastern State Penitentiary, which exists to this day, which was a very idealistic idea that believed in sort of spiritual reform and transformation. Really quiet places, and now spooky. But part of the idea that maybe something could be really done with that. So.
Well, then we have some of the other, state institutions and whatnot that when they are getting overcrowded
Jill Weiss Simmons again.
and like facing economic challenges and stuff, then they turn to sterilization as a condition for release. So trading consent, I don't know if you can consent if you're just trying to get out of an institution of some sort, but trading consent for release then becomes a way that sterilizations actually increase, I think, during the Great Depression and even after, I think, Sarah, like even after we hear about the atrocities of Nazi Germany.
Yeah, I mean, I think that both of them really were done between like the early 30s and maybe the 50s. But yeah, there were periods where you don't see them, at least as far as the state hospitals go. Through the 1940s, you don't really see them. But Max Barr, who was superintendent of Central State Hospital at the time, attributed that more to the lack of surgeons. They were all off at war, and so there was no one there to actually perform the sterilization. So when you look at the annual, what's unfortunate about the information we have about the numbers of sterilizations is that we have an idea of how many were done across the state hospital system, but we don't know who was sterilized necessarily. We don't even know specific data to different hospitals. But he talks later in his life about how they were reporting zero during that period because there was no one there to perform them, not because they had thought better of it.
Yeah. Not because they had actually stopped it or this is bad, but because all the doctors were gone, they were off fighting.
This is a great thread to talking about like institutionalization. What
Nicole.
I guess in the field of like mental health care and institutionalization, what were some of the common reasons for somebody to be institutionalized that are definitely treatable today that wouldn't require that level of incarceration, institutional, just looking at it long term?
In the early years, I mean, it fluctuates throughout time as our understanding of these things change and evolves, and as psychiatry becomes more of a specialty. But you see a lot of diagnosis of like mania and dementia precox, which we now call schizophrenia. A lot of degenerative diseases, like different kinds of senility. But then, like in the really early years, you don't even get like a diagnosis in the records. What you get is like, this person's obsessed with religion, or this person like, wanders at night. You get more like descriptions of the issues that they were facing rather than like an actual diagnosis, and it changes over time. After that, maybe Jim could take it from there. After about the late 1940s, I kind of lose interest.
Looks like that they were just looking for a reason to sterilize people.
Right, exactly. And it really does come down to what is what is the ultimate goal? Is it the betterment of society? Is it the extermination of what you consider lesser humans? Because then that gets into a whole other, really, I mean, almost a religious overtone as to, well, are you playing God?
Yeah.
You know? And I don't know that there's a definitive answer there, other than we kind of have to look at it from our own point of view and determine what you're willing to do, what you're willing to allow as a society, you know. And it once again, it goes into the whole you know, not just survival of the fittest, but the benefits for the most, right? If you have to kill, for example, if you have to kill 100 people, right? But by doing so, 1 million are saved. Is that it's like the trolley problem, right? And there's no right or wrong in that, in my opinion. It's up to you, your own personal belief system. Is it okay to hurt people so that more people get saved? And if that's the case, then it's a slippery slope. It's a slippery slope, because then you get into, well, for example, this medication is okay to give because even though it's going to hurt a percentage of the people, the overall benefit is worth it. Well, benefit for whom and benefit how? What? Like, there's so many variables that it really is like a case by case basis. And ultimately, if you're willing to hurt one person, you're willing to hurt plenty of people. Yep. Then it's just a numbers game. I prefer we're just not going to hurt anyone.
No.
You know, people can live their lives and do what they want. You know, very much a leave me alone. What's that? There's a meme. I want the gay couple to be able to grow their marijuana plants and defend them with AR-15s. Yeah, I don't care what you do in your bedroom. I legitimately don't. As long as it's consenting adults, leave the damn kids alone and stop forcing your beliefs on other people. It's that simple.
Even before that, probably around the turn of the century, that century, and before, it's hard to find a complete accurate data, but there's thought that greater than 50% of the people in institutions such as this had tertiary syphilis. So syphilis was by far the most significant reason why people would be in one of these institutions. At some point,
yeah, syphilis was very, very prevalent at the time. And for those who don't know, syphilis has basically a mind rotting component to it. It attacks the brain. So it can do, you guys ever see the show House? There was an episode where an old lady had syphilis and it awakened her sex drive, basically. Have you seen the show House?
I haven't.
Okay.
But I know what you're talking about,
the
show.
Yeah, the show, that particular episode, it was a woman who had syphilis, and it had already done the damage to her brain. So no matter what happened, she was still going to be that way, but they could stop it from progressing. So that's what he's saying, that the majority of the patients at that time were because of this disease.
At one time, there was a sense that there was a separation between adults who acquired a condition and children or youth that had a level of disability that families at home who normally would absorb, in a typical sort of farm family would absorb a slower, individual that had what would now call intellectual disability disorder. But, there was a sense that they then went to an institution. And down the road, some of the institutions for some of the worst, that
was weird.
That was odd. His audio, just so you know, it's not us. The audio on the video just suddenly changed. I don't know why.
The history of mental health institution sort of points to the 50s when some early antipsychotic medications that at least helped and certainly made them more manageable, as well as the early parts of a movement toward deinstitutionalization occurred. That sort of moves on up into the 70s and 80s, partly because of the horrible conditions and overcrowding.
Yeah, it was terrible.
And one can really critique how we did with deinstitutionalization, but that's probably
That's a whole different panel discussion.
Yeah,
And I agree.
Well, you mentioned
Yeah, dude. Obviously, there's critiques to be made about the whole institutionalism and the way these places were designed. We already talked about it. It's an entirely different discussion, as she said, and I do agree with that. But we need to acknowledge it, and we need to understand that a lot of times there's actually a YouTube series called Unintended Consequences, and it's things that people have done and the unintended consequences that came along with it. And some of them are completely there's no way to predict this crazy stuff that happened. But it's an example. Every time we interact with our environment, the butterfly effect.
Yep.
Every time we interact with our environment, changes happen.
That's a good movie.
What's that?
That's a good movie.
It is a really good movie. Yeah, if you haven't seen the original Butterfly Effect, the sequels were meh. Yeah. But the original
with Ashton Kutcher,
yes, it was a phenomenal movie.
Sure, series. Oh, go ahead. I was just gonna say, in terms of things that you might be institutionalized for that you would not be today, would include things like alcoholism or epilepsy, which it was considered a mental illness before it was understood as a neurological condition. And then there are things that we wouldn't even consider a mental illness today, up until the 1970s, homosexuality was listed in the DSM as an initial diagnosis of mental illness, and now we have a completely different understanding of that. So,
and I think when you get into the 40s and 50s, we really did have a two-class system of psychiatric or mental hospitals, and some which were trust fund children or babies were really, they were confined and was a lot of personal choice or autonomy. But many women who had hysteria would be, hospitalized against their will.
And I want to point out real quick, that was actually a favored way to get rid of your spouse and inherit their stuff. There were some very unsavory and unscrupulous people who would marry into wealth and then, or even, be wealthy themselves, but marry an individual and then have this individual declared incompetent and locked away so that they could take over their fortune. It's 10 or 15 more seconds left, and then we'll.
And then, same thing with the people with mania and that kind of thing. But they weren't really the public institutions that were, the most hard to stomach.
Okay. So, I think we pretty much stayed on top of commenting, but I would like people to understand how different things have gotten just over time. The way that society has evolved, the things that we have considered normal or acceptable have greatly changed over time. Slavery is a perfect example, right? Yep. There was a time when even in this country, it was perfectly acceptable to own people. Obviously, that's not freaking okay.
No, it's not.
Yeah.
But it was a different time. We're judging from our standards.
Right. It was a different time, and to judge history by the standards of modern life is silly. It's just silly.
100 years from now, they're going to be judging how we're doing.
Exactly. And so you can't look at things through the lens of the current time. You really have to look at them through what was going on at the time. So we got one more clip for you, and it is approximately 2 minutes long. And it starts with this Dr. James Pytel again. He's who was on, but it's actually Nicole Martinez Legrand.
Talk about, forced sterilization during World War II, there being a lack of sterilization. Did this continue in the United States beyond 1940? 45.
Good question.
Definitely.
Not all at once. Not all at once, yeah.
I mean, in Indiana, so the 1907 law had been, so Governor Marshall, once he came to office, he said, let's stop doing this. Like, this makes me uncomfortable. And he sort of cut off funding for it. And then that law wasn't really declared unconstitutional and repealed until 1921. And then the new law in 1927 that like sort of further narrowed the types of people who were targeted in the law, but that law was not repealed in Indiana until 1974. And so
Yeah.
Whoa!
Yeah. That's the one that, yeah.
That law was in effect until I was born. I was born in 1974. So,
Okay.
yeah. Holy crap, dude.
Yeah.
That just goes to show you how long, like 50 years, essentially, it was in, even longer if you consider it was just repealed, the old one, and then they put a new one in, and that lasted till 1974. My goodness, man.
Yeah.
up until that point, you do see sterilization. There are estimates that between 1907 and 1974 in Indiana alone, there were about 2,500 sterilizations done that were reported.
There's probably
Also
more.
kind of seeing this time,
And this is Jill Weiss Simmons.
and leading up to that, the repeal of that law, a shift in the language from hereditary defects and like that kind of original language around eugenics to ideas about bad parenting by poor families. So it's sort of shifting from, sterilization to other kinds of policing the poor and their decision making.
Yeah. Wow.
Mhm.
Wow. So basically, it shifted from these, like, there are genetic defects, there are issues with the genetic content, right? The DNA or whatever, to, well, because this person was born or going to be born to a poor family, it's worth it to just exterminate them. That's craziness.
It is.
It's craziness. So Indiana has quite a sordid and long history with eugenics. So before Hoosiers start throwing around various words or I guess talking smack about other countries, maybe particularly in Europe during the 30s and 40s, embracing eugenics, that law was here until the 70s. That is nuts.
That
dude.
is nuts.
That is nuts, because I thought we learned our lesson in World War II. Like, and I'm not going to go there, but it could absolutely branch into other, the other areas. But I think it's important for people to understand that we're not that far removed from the thought process that told us it was okay to sterilize people. We're not far from that.
No, we're not. And I think some people still have that mentality.
They do. They absolutely do. And as long as you're a member of a certain class, like, for example, white people, there are many people who will tell you it's perfectly okay to exterminate white people. White people had their time. Let's get rid of them. And these are allegedly, or at least according to them, the most inclusive and loving people that are out there.
Allegedly.
Exactly. It's garbage.
Yeah.
They know it's garbage. We know it's garbage. But what are you going to do? So I'm fascinated by this. I think it's really interesting the level of reform, I guess, that they were willing to go to in their mind at the time, at least the initial 1905 law. The idea was to improve the breeding stock, to improve the human element of the state of Indiana. Whether that's right or wrong, that's for you to determine, not me. But it in the 20s, when they redid the law, that was aimed at poor people. And that to stay till the 70s is mind-blowing.
Yeah, I was shocked when I heard that.
Yeah. So again, ladies and gentlemen, I want to make sure you guys can find this if you want. It is on C-SPAN, and it's called Eugenics and the Law. And it was posted November 22nd of 2022. So it's not old at all, a couple years. Go check it out if you want. But I think we covered the vast majority of the important concepts discussed in it. And it really makes you wonder, are we as far as we think we are from an uncivilized society? And apparently not, because there are laws in various countries where they do exterminate babies in the womb that have certain genetic conditions.
Yeah.
Down syndrome being the one that, and
I think it was Iceland. I think Iceland's the country that has 0% of their population has Down syndrome.
Yep. Canada is moving to this type of system. A lot of the social health care systems are deciding, well, if we just abort these individuals, then we don't have to take care of them for their entire life. I mean, it's kind of a messed up.
It is messed
process.
up. Yeah.
You don't think, death panels exist.
They do.
They do. They absolutely do. So thank you very much for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. We appreciate your time, and we hope to see you again very, very soon. God bless you. God bless Indiana, even with their eugenics ass. And God bless the United States of America. Good night.
If you'd like to support the show, please visit our Patreon at patreon.com/Deion's Daily Dose. This has been Deion's Daily Dose, hosted by Deion Bergeron. Executive producers, Sean Holgram and Michael Beebe. Copyright 2024. Deion's Daily Dose, all rights reserved.